Rain hammered the Arizona desert like God's own anger that night. Lightning split the black sky above Silver Creek as Evie Sloane stood alone in the middle of her yard, heart slamming against her ribs. Her 10-year-old son, Jamie, clung to the back of her soaked dress, small hands shaking so hard she could feel every tremor through the wet fabric. 3 riders thundered toward them through the downpour, guns already blazing. Bullets whistled past her ear. One shattered the wooden post beside her. Another kicked up dirt inches from Jamie's bare feet. Evie's breath came sharp and fast. Her fingers, cold and slippery, closed around the old Colt at her hip. For 8 long years she had sworn she would never touch a gun again. Never. But tonight her son's life hung by a thread. She shoved Jamie behind the water trough. "Stay down, baby. Don't look." Her voice cracked, but her hands remembered. The first rider charged straight at them. Evie raised the Colt, rain streaming into her eyes. She squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked like thunder. The man jerked backward and tumbled from the saddle. A second rider veered left, firing wildly. Evie spun, steadied her breath the way her late husband once taught her in secret, and fired again. Another man cried out and fell. The third rider pulled his horse up hard, realizing too late what he was facing. He raised his pistol, aiming straight at the trough where Jamie hid. Time slowed. Evie's heart screamed. She stepped forward into the open rain, and tears mixing on her face, and pulled the trigger one final time. The last bullet found its mark. The rider slumped forward and slid to the muddy ground. Silence fell, broken only by the relentless rain and the terrified breathing of her little boy. Evie dropped to her knees, the smoking Colt still tight in her trembling hand. She pulled Jamie into her arms, pressing his face against her chest so he wouldn't see the bodies. "Mama, you shot them," he whispered, voice small and broken. "I had to, sweetheart," she breathed, kissing the top of his wet head. "I had to." But deep inside, something she had buried for 8 years had just clawed its way back into the light. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving only thick, red mud and heavy silence over Silver Creek. Evie stood on the porch of the general store, Jamie's small hand gripped tightly in hers, when Silas Crowe rode into town like he owned the very air people breathed. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in a black coat worth more than most men earned in a year, he stopped his horse in the middle of the street and looked straight at her. His voice rang out cold and clear for every soul in Silver Creek to hear. "That woman, Evie Sloane, is a cold-blooded killer. Last night she murdered 3 of my men in cold blood. She's dangerous. And that piece of land she's squatting on, it belongs to me now. The Silver Queen mine runs right under it. Any man who stands with her stands against this town." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eyes that once offered friendly nods now turned away. Women pulled their children closer. Men shifted uncomfortably and looked at the ground. In less than 24 hours, the entire town of Silver Creek turned its back on Evie Sloane. She stood there, rain from last night, still dripping from the roof onto her shoulders, feeling the weight of every stare like stones being piled on her chest. Jamie looked up at her, his young face pale with fear and confusion. "Mama, why are they looking at us like that?" Evie swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to scream the truth. She wanted to tell them those men came to kill her son and steal their only home. But the words died on her lips. Because the moment she fired those shots, the secret she had carried for 8 long years was no longer hidden. And Silas Crowe had just declared war. This is the story of a mother who was forced to become something she swore she would never be again. to protect the only thing that mattered. A story about how one single night of courage can turn an entire town against you, and how far a woman will go when everything she loves is on the line. The days that followed felt heavier than the Arizona heat. Evie Sloane moved through Silver Creek like a ghost no one wanted to see. Storekeepers suddenly had no flour left when she stepped inside. Women crossed the street the moment they spotted her coming. Even the old church bell seemed to ring a little colder on Sunday morning. Silas Crowe had wasted no time. Word spread faster than wildfire across the desert. Marshal Tate Whitaker had been seen riding out to the Crowe Ranch with a fat envelope in his saddlebag. By the next afternoon, fresh rumors were crawling through every saloon and porch like poisonous snakes. They say she's dangerous. Killed 3 men without blinking, probably the same one who shot her own husband years ago. Keep your children away from that Sloane woman. She's a threat to every decent family in Silver Creek. Evie heard every whisper. She felt every stare burning into her back. But the worst pain didn't come from the town. It came from her own son. Jamie had always been a bright, laughing boy who ran barefoot with the other children after school. Now he came home earlier each day, shoulders hunched, eyes on the ground. His friends no longer waited for him by the creek. When Evie gently asked what happened, he only shook his head and whispered, "They said, 'My mama's a killer.' They don't want to play with me anymore." Every night after she tucked him into bed, Evie would sit in the dark kitchen and listen to the soft, broken sounds of her little boy crying into his pillow. Each sob felt like a knife twisting slowly in her chest. She wanted to scream. She wanted to march into the marshal's office and tell the truth. But fear held her tongue tighter than any rope. Late one evening, when the weight became too much to carry alone, Evie wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked toward the only 2 people who hadn't yet turned their backs. First, she stopped at the Silver Dollar Saloon. Ruby Delgado stood behind the long mahogany bar, wiping glasses with slow, deliberate hands. Her dark eyes lifted when Evie entered, and for the first time in days, someone looked at her without flinching. "Rough week, honey?" Ruby asked softly, pouring a cup of coffee without being asked. Evie's hands trembled as she accepted the warm mug. "I don't know how much longer I can keep Jamie safe," she whispered. "They're poisoning the whole town against us." Ruby leaned closer, voice low but steady. "Silas Crowe doesn't just want your land, Evie. Men like him never stop at dirt and silver. They want silence. And I think whatever happened to your husband 8 years ago, he's terrified it's about to come screaming back into the light." The words landed heavy in Evie's stomach. Later that same night, she found herself at old Gus Harlan's blacksmith shop on the edge of town. The forge glowed blood red in the darkness, casting long shadows across the old man's weathered face. Gus had known her father years ago. He had never been one for gossip. He didn't speak at first, just pumped the bellows slowly, letting the fire roar. Evie stood near the heat arms wrapped around herself. "Gus, did my husband ever tell you anything before he died? Anything about the mine? Or Silas Crowe?" The old blacksmith paused, hammer resting on the anvil. His voice came rough like gravel under boots. "Your man was asking too many questions about missing silver shipments. Questions that made powerful men nervous. Next thing anyone knew, he was found dead in a dry gulch with a single bullet in his back. Convenient, wasn't it?" Evie felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. All these years she had believed it was a robbery gone wrong. But now the pieces were sliding into place, dark and ugly. Silas Crowe didn't just want her land. He needed to bury the truth forever. And she was the last living witness who might dig it up. Fear rose in her throat like black dust. For one terrifying moment, Evie wanted to run, to pack everything they owned and disappear into the desert before sunrise. Let Silas have the land. Let the town believe whatever lies they wanted. But then she remembered Jamie's quiet tears in the dark. She remembered the way his small hand had clutched hers that stormy night when bullets flew. She remembered the promise she made to herself the morning after her husband died. No one would ever take her son's future away. Evie straightened her back, even as fresh tears burned behind her eyes. "I'm so tired, Gus," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't break. Can't. Not while Jamie still needs me to stand." Old Gus nodded slowly, the fire reflecting in his tired eyes. "Then stand, girl. But don't stand alone. Not if you want any chance of seeing the sun rise on the other side of this." Evie left the forge with her heart still heavy. Yet somewhere deep inside, a tiny, fragile spark of hope refused to die. She didn't know how she would fight a man as powerful as Silas Crowe. She only knew she had no choice. Because for her son, she would face the devil himself if she had to. This story reminds us that even when the whole world turns against a mother, the love she carries for her child can become the strongest weapon of all. The air in Silver Creek grew thicker with every passing day. Fear had settled over the town, like fine black dust from the mines. People spoke in low voices. Doors that once stayed open now closed early. And Evie Sloane felt the walls closing in around her and her son. Then one dusty afternoon, a new figure rode slowly down the main street. Ryder Kane had only been sheriff for 3 weeks. Young, tall, with quiet gray eyes that seemed to see more than most men wanted him to. He had come from Texas with a reputation for fairness and not much else. Most folks figured he wouldn't last long against men like Silas Crowe. But Ryder Kane was already asking questions. He had listened to the stories floating around town. 3 dead men, a woman with a gun, a piece of land suddenly worth a fortune. Something about the way Silas told it felt too clean, too convenient. So he came looking for Evie. She was hanging laundry behind her small cabin when she saw him approaching on horseback. Her hands froze on the damp sheet. For a moment, old panic rose sharp in her throat. Another man in a badge, another person who might destroy what little she had left. Ryder dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Mrs. Sloane," he said, voice calm and low, "I'm not here to arrest you. I just want to talk, if you'll let me." Evie studied his face for a long moment. She saw no cruelty there, only careful curiosity. Still her heart hammered as she nodded once and led him to the shaded porch. They sat across from each other on 2 worn wooden chairs. Jamie peeked from the doorway, wide-eyed and silent. Ryder didn't rush. He spoke gently, choosing words with care. "I've heard what people are saying about that night. But I've also seen how quick a powerful man can shape the truth to fit his pockets. I'd like to hear your side. When you're ready." Evie's fingers twisted in her lap. Memories she had tried so hard to bury pressed against her chest. The smell of gun smoke, the sound of her son's frightened breathing, the weight of the Colt in her hand. She spoke slowly at first voice, barely above a whisper. She told him about the fear about protecting Jamie, about the years of running from shadows she couldn't name. She didn't tell him everything. Not yet, but Ryder listened without interrupting, his gray eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You're a strong woman, Mrs. Sloane," he said finally. "Stronger than most men I've known. Raising that boy alone, carrying whatever burden you're carrying. It takes real courage." For the first time in many days, Evie felt seen. Not as a threat, not as a killer, just as a mother trying desperately to hold her small world together. But peace never lasted long in Silver Creek. 2 nights later, flames lit up the sky. Silas Crowe's men had set fire to the town's main supply warehouse. Barrels of flour, sacks of beans, winter blankets, everything the poor families depended on, went up in thick, black smoke. The message was clear: stand with Evie Sloane, and you will pay for it. Chaos erupted. People ran through the streets, shouting. Children cried, men cursed and formed bucket lines that seemed hopeless against the roaring flames. Evie stood at the edge of the crowd. Jamie pressed tight against her side, watching the orange glow reflect in terrified eyes. She felt the guilt like a stone in her stomach. This was because of her, because she refused to run. In the middle of the panic, Ryder Kane stepped onto the raised platform near the burned warehouse. His badge caught the firelight as he raised his voice above the noise. "Listen to me, people of Silver Creek," the crowd quieted, turning toward the young sheriff. "I will not stand by while fear and lies run this town. I'm opening a fair investigation into what happened at the Sloane property. No favors, no bribes. Just the truth. And I expect every man here to let justice run its course. Not Silas Crowe's version of it." A stunned silence fell. Evie's breath caught. She stared at Ryder, heart pounding with something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Small, fragile, dangerous, but real. Later that night, when the last embers had been drowned and the town had gone quiet, Ryder found her again. This time behind her cabin, where the desert wind carried the faint smell of smoke. He stood a respectful distance away, hat in his hands. "Mrs. Sloane, I meant what I said today. But if I'm going to help you, I need to know everything. The real story, about your husband, about why Silas is so desperate to silence you." Evie looked away, staring into the dark desert. Her hands trembled at her sides. Trusting a man again felt like stepping onto thin ice over a deep river. One wrong move, and everything could shatter. Jamie's future, her own fragile safety, the last pieces of her heart she had managed to keep intact. She turned back to Ryder, eyes shining with unshed tears and old wounds. "I want to believe you're different," she whispered. "But I've trusted before, and it cost me almost everything." Ryder nodded slowly, his voice steady but gentle. "I'm not asking you to trust me tonight. I'm only asking you to consider it. Because if you keep carrying this alone, I'm afraid it will break you. And that boy needs his mother whole." He left her standing there under the vast Arizona sky, heart torn between fear and the first faint light of possibility. Evie pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat beneath her fingers. For the first time since the storm, she wondered if she might not have to face the coming darkness completely alone. This story shows us that sometimes the bravest thing a wounded soul can do is open the door just a crack to let the right person in. The desert wind carried a new kind of silence after Ryder's promise. But Silas Crowe did not wait for justice to move slowly. 2 days later, Marshal Tate Whitaker rode into town with fresh papers in his saddlebag. He stood on the steps of the town hall and read them aloud, in a loud official voice for everyone to hear. Evidence has come to light that Evie Sloane murdered her husband 8 years ago, so she could claim the rich silver vein running beneath their land. She is wanted for murder and theft. Any citizen found helping her will be charged as an accomplice. The words struck Evie like a slap across the face. She stood frozen near the mercantile, Jamie's hand suddenly cold and tight in hers. The same people who had begun to look at her with hesitant sympathy now stepped back again, eyes wide with fresh fear. That same afternoon, while Evie was inside the general store trading eggs for salt, it happened. Jamie had been playing with a stick in the dirt just outside the door. One moment he was there. The next, he was gone. Only his small hat lay trampled in the dust. Evie burst out of the store, heart exploding in her chest. "Jamie," she screamed, a voice raw and breaking. Jamie, no answer. Only the hot wind whipping across the empty street. A single note had been pinned to the hitching post with a knife. "Sign the deed over to Silas Crowe by sunset, or you'll never see your boy again." The world tilted. Evie's knees nearly buckled. For one terrible second, all the strength she had gathered threatened to collapse. Memories of her husband's cold body flashed behind her eyes. The sound of Jamie's quiet crying at night. The feel of his small arms around her neck during the storm. She could not lose him. Not her son. Not the only light left in her life. Without another word, Evie ran to the livery stable, grabbed her horse bareback, and rode straight into the red sandstorm that had begun to rise on the horizon. The storm swallowed her whole. Red dust stung her eyes and filled her lungs. She rode blind, calling her son's name until her voice grew hoarse. Every gust of wind felt like laughter from the devil himself. "Jamie. Hold on, baby. Mama's coming." Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the grit. Despair clawed at her chest, but beneath it burned something fiercer, a mother's rage, ancient and unstoppable. Meanwhile, at the edge of the Silver Queen mine, Ryder Kane had been following his own trail of questions. What he found in an old locked box inside the marshal's office made his blood run cold. Letters, payment records, a single bullet casing that matched the type used on Evie's husband years ago, all pointing straight to Silas Crowe. Ryder's jaw tightened. He knew what this meant. If he stood with Evie now, he would likely lose his badge. Maybe even his life. Still, he saddled his horse and rode hard toward the mine under a rising moon. He arrived just as Silas Crowe stepped out of the shadows, flanked by 3 armed men. Jamie sat bound and gagged on a crate nearby, eyes wide with terror, but alive. Sheriff Silas drawled with a cold smile, "You're making a serious mistake. Walk away now and keep your nice new badge." Ryder's hand rested near his gun, voice steady but low. "Let the boy go, Crowe. This ends tonight." The tension crackled like dry lightning. The 2 men faced each other beneath the silver moonlight, and the entrance to the dark mine yawning behind them like an open grave. At that same moment, Evie emerged from the dying sandstorm horse, lathered and breathing hard. She slid from the saddle and stumbled forward, eyes locking instantly on her son. Jamie Silas turned, surprise flashing across his face for the first time. Evie stood there, hair wild, dress torn and covered in red dust, looking every bit the desperate mother she was. But her voice, when it came, carried steel. "You took my husband. You spread lies about me. You turned this town against us. But you will not take my son." Silas laughed softly, though his eyes were hard. "Then sign the papers, Mrs. Sloane. Give me the land, and maybe I'll let the boy live. Or keep your precious truth and watch him die right here." Evie's hands shook as she looked at Jamie's terrified face. The choice tore at her like a knife twisting in her soul. She could sign. She could give up the land, swallow her pride, let the world keep believing she was a murderer. Her son would be safe. Or she could refuse and risk losing the only person she had left to love. Tears burned hot tracks down her dust-covered cheeks. Her heart screamed in silent agony. Ryder watched her, his own face tight with emotion. He knew what this moment was costing her. The wind howled across the mine entrance. Moonlight glinted on guns and tears. Evie took one trembling step forward, eyes never leaving her son. In that frozen heartbeat, everything hung in the balance: her honor, her past, her future, and the life of the child she would die for. This story shows us that true courage is not the absence of fear. It is standing in the middle of it when everything you love is at stake. The morning of the public hearing dawned bright and merciless over Silver Creek. The entire town gathered in the dusty square. Men stood with arms crossed. Women held their children close. The air felt thick, charged with months of whispers, fear, and doubt. Evie Sloane walked slowly to the front, her hand never letting go of Jamie's small fingers. The boy stayed pressed against her side, still pale from his ordeal, but alive. Alive because she had refused to break. She stood before them, all the same people who had turned away from her, the same eyes that had judged her so quickly. Her dress was simple and worn, her hands rough from work, but her chin stayed high. When Judge Harlan called her name, Evie took a slow, shaky breath. Her voice started quiet, trembling like a leaf in the desert wind. 8 years ago, my husband asked too many questions about missing silver from the Crowe mines. He wanted the truth. Silas Crowe made sure he never spoke again. They left him in a dry gulch with one bullet in his back. I was told it was robbers. I believed it until the night those men came for my land and my son. She paused, tears glistening but not falling. I fired those shots in the storm to save Jamie. I never wanted to touch a gun again. But a mother protects her child, even when the whole world calls her a monster. The square was completely silent. Only the wind moved across the rooftops. Then Ryder Kane stepped forward. He placed a small wooden box on the table and opened it slowly. Inside lay old letters, payment slips, and a single bullet casing. These belonged to Marshal Tate Whitaker Ryder, said his voice clear and steady. They prove Silas Crowe ordered the killing of Evie's husband and paid good money to hide it. The same man who tried to kidnap her son 2 days ago. Marshal Tate Whitaker's face went ash white. He looked at Silas, then at the angry crowd, and something inside him finally cracked. I can't do this anymore, he stammered, stepping away from Silas. Crowe forced me. He paid me to plant evidence. I'm done. It's all true. Gasps rippled through the square like a wave. Old Gus Harlan rose next, his old voice, rough but strong from years at the forge. I knew Evie's husband. He was an honest man. Silas Crowe threatened anyone who got too close to that silver vein. I stayed quiet too long. Not anymore. Ruby Delgado stood up from the back row, her dark eyes flashing. Silas came to my saloon more than once, bragging how he'd crush anyone who stood in his way. He thought money could buy silence. Today it buys him nothing. One by one, others found their courage. A storekeeper, a miner's widow, even the town blacksmith's apprentice. Their voices joined together, shaky at first, then stronger, a chorus of truth that had been buried too long. Silas Crowe stood alone now, his proud shoulders collapsing inward. The powerful man who had ruled Silver Creek with fear and gold looked suddenly small. His face twisted with rage and disbelief as the last of his secrets spilled into the open air. "You fools," he snarled, but his voice carried no power anymore. Judge Harlan struck the gavel hard. "Silas Crowe, you are hereby stripped of all claims to the Sloane land. You will face charges for murder, kidnapping, and corruption. Marshal Whitaker will be held accountable as well. This town has seen enough darkness." The crowd erupted, not in anger, but in something closer to relief. Some clapped, some simply nodded, eyes wet with regret. Evie dropped to her knees and pulled Jamie into her arms, holding him so tight. He laughed through his tears. "Mama, it's over," he whispered against her neck. She kissed his dusty hair voice, breaking with pure, exhausted joy. "Yes, baby. It's over." Later that evening, as the sun painted the desert gold and crimson, Evie and Ryder stood together on the high ridge overlooking Silver Creek. Below them, the town looked peaceful again. Children ran through the streets. Jamie was among them now, laughing as he chased a hoop with the same boys who had once avoided him. The sound of his laughter floated up the hill like music Evie had almost forgotten. Ryder stood close, but not touching his hat in his hands. "You didn't have to do it alone," he said softly. "Not anymore." Evie looked at him, eyes still carrying the shadows of everything she had endured. But there was light in them now, too quiet, careful and real. "I was so afraid to trust again," she whispered. "Afraid it would cost me everything. But today the truth finally spoke, louder than fear." Ryder turned to face her, fully his gray eyes, warm in the fading light. "You showed this town what real strength looks like, Evie. Not the kind that comes from power or money. The kind that comes from love. From a mother who refused to break." She smiled, then small, tired, but genuine. For the first time in many years, the weight on her chest felt lighter. As the last rays of sunlight touched the rooftops of Silver Creek, Evie Sloane stood tall beside the man who had chosen justice over safety. Below them, her son played freely, his future no longer shadowed by lies. She had kept her land. She had protected her child. And in doing so, she had helped an entire town remember what courage truly meant. This story reminds us that one mother's unbreakable love can change the heart of a town. And that real justice often begins when ordinary people finally find the courage to stand up and speak the truth. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.